My name is Emily, and I will never forget this day, which must have been the most beautiful of my life. It was a Saturday in June. The sun shone on the little church of Saint-Germain-des-Prés where I was going to marry Thomas, the man I had loved for 5 years. The air was filled with the scent of freshly cut roses, and soft music escaped from the open doors of the church. I stood in a small back room, nervously adjusting my veil in front of a full-length mirror. My best friend, Sophie, was helping me straighten out the wrinkles in my dress. My heart was racing, a mixture of excitement and anxiety. I had waited so long for this moment, and now that it was here, I felt overwhelmed with emotion. "You look beautiful, Emily," Sophie said to me, placing her hands on my shoulders. "Thomas will be dazzled." I smile at him in the mirror, grateful for his reassuring presence. We had known each other since high school, and she had been by my side through every important step in my life. Today was no exception. Suddenly we heard a commotion coming from the entrance to the church. Voices were raised, louder and louder. Sophie and I exchanged a worried look. "What's going on?" I whispered, feeling my stomach drop. Sophie opened the door a crack to take a look. "I don't know," she said, looking perplexed. "There is a crowd near the entrance." My father, who was to lead me to the altar, appeared at the door, his face pale. "Emily, my darling," he said softly, "there is a problem." Before I could ask what it was, the door burst open, and Martine, Thomas' mother, burst into the room. His face was red with anger, his eyes flashing. "You," she shouted, pointing at me. "How dare you?" I took a step back, shocked by the violence in his tone. "Madame Leblanc," I stammered, "what's going on?" "Don't play innocent with me," she screamed. "You stole my emerald ring, the one my grandmother left me." Silence fell in the small room. I felt everyone's eyes turn towards me. My heart began to pound even harder, this time out of fear and confusion. I don't understand," I said, my voice barely audible. "I have never seen your ring, Madame Leblanc." But Martine didn't want to hear anything. She continued to accuse me, her voice carrying throughout the church. I could hear the murmurs of the guests, their worried whispers. Thomas appeared at the door, his face serious. His eyes moved from his mother to me, incomprehension written on his face. "Emily," he said in a tense voice, "is that true?" I felt my heart break as I heard the doubt in his voice. How could he believe I was capable of such a thing? "Thomas," I said, with tears in my eyes, "I swear I didn't do anything. I never saw that ring." But the damage was done. Doubt had set in, and I could see it in Thomas's eyes, in those of our guests who had gathered at the door. The next few minutes were a whirlwind of confusion and pain. Martine's accusations continued to rain down, more and more virulent. Thomas remained silent, his gaze moving from his mother to me, unable to take sides. I felt trapped, cornered. How did we get here? How had this day, which was supposed to be the most beautiful day of my life, turned into a nightmare? Sophie tried to defend me, to calm the situation, but her voice was lost in the tumult. My father stayed by my side, a protective hand on my shoulder. Finally, Thomas spoke. His voice was cold, distant, so different from that of the man I loved. "Emily, if you took this ring, give it back now. Otherwise, the marriage is cancelled." These words hit me like a punch. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The man I loved, the man who would be my husband in a few minutes, was now threatening to annul our marriage based on unfounded accusations. "Thomas," I begged, tears flowing freely down my cheeks, "I swear I don't have that ring. I've never seen it. How can you doubt me?" But my words seemed to fall into thin air. Thomas' gaze was hard, influenced by his mother's accusations and perhaps by his own doubts. The guests were starting to get restless. I heard their murmurs, their speculations. Some took my side, others that of Martine. The atmosphere of joy and love that should have reigned on that day had transformed into one heavy with suspicion and judgment. I felt alone, betrayed, humiliated. How could I prove my innocence? How could I convince Thomas, the man I loved more than anything, that I had done nothing wrong? The minutes passed, endlessly. Every second that passed seemed to drive a deeper wedge between Thomas and me. I saw our future, all our dreams and plans, crumbling before my eyes. Finally, unable to bear this situation any longer, I made a decision. With all the dignity I could muster, I turned to Thomas. "If you can't trust me today," I said in a shaky but determined voice, "then maybe we shouldn't get married at all." A dead silence fell over the assembly. I saw the shock on Thomas' face, but I couldn't back down. I needed him to understand the seriousness of the situation, to realize how much his mistrust was hurting me. Without waiting for his response, I turned to my father and Sophie. "Take me away from here," I whispered. As we headed towards the exit, I heard Thomas' voice calling my name. But I didn't turn around. My heart was in pieces, my trust shattered. What was supposed to be the happiest day of my life had turned into my worst nightmare. As I left the church, I felt the sun on my face, a cruel contrast to the storm raging in my heart. I didn't know what the future held for me, but one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again. I found myself in front of the Saint-Germain-des-Prés church, my heart in pieces and my mind in disarray. The June sun, which a few minutes earlier had seemed so promising to me, now seemed cruelly indifferent to my distress. Passers-by stared at me, intrigued by this bride crying on the steps of the church. I must have put on a pitiful spectacle. Sophie held me by the shoulders, gently leading me away from the entrance. My father, with a serious face, tried to disperse the curious people who were beginning to gather. I could still hear the echoes of the argument inside the church, Martine's shrill voice dominating all the others. "Come, Emily," Sophie whispered. "Let's go somewhere quieter." I let myself be guided, like an automaton, to a small cafe a few steps away. The boss, seeing my state, quickly installed us in a quiet corner, out of sight. I collapsed into a chair, unable to hold back my sobs any longer. How could he do this to me? I sobbed, my hands trembling. How could he doubt me? Sophie hugged me, whispering comforting words to me that I didn't even hear. My father sat across from me, his face showing suppressed anger. "My dear," he said softly, "we all know you didn't do anything wrong. This woman is crazy, and Thomas should have defended you." His words, while comforting, only increased the pain in my chest. Yes, Thomas should have defended me. He should have believed in me, in us. But he hadn't done it. Suddenly, the cafe door burst open. Thomas stood there, out of breath, his eyes red. My heart leapt in my chest, a mixture of hope and fear. "Emily," he said, approaching our table. "We need to talk." My father jumped up, placing himself between Thomas and me. "I think you've done enough, boy," he growled. But I put a hand on my father's arm. Still, I needed to hear what Thomas had to say. Maybe he would apologize, maybe he would finally believe me. "It's okay, Dad," I said in a weak voice. "Let him talk." Thomas approached, hesitant. I could see the conflict in his eyes, the struggle between his love for me and his duty to his family. "Emily," he began, "I'm sorry about what happened at the church. My mother, she's upset. This ring means a lot to her." I couldn't believe my ears. After everything that had just happened, he was still justifying his mother's actions. "And me, Thomas?" I asked, my voice shaking with anger and sorrow. "Don't I mean anything to you? How could you think I would steal anything?" Thomas looked down, unable to meet my gaze. "I don't know what to think, Emily. My mother is so sure of herself." It was too much. The pain in my chest turned into cold rage. I stood up, facing the man I thought I knew, who I thought I loved. "Is your mother sure of herself?" I repeated, incredulous. "And me, Thomas? Are you not sure of me? Of my integrity? Of my love for you?" The cafe patrons were now staring at us openly, captivated by our drama playing out before them. But I didn't care. All that mattered in that moment was Thomas and me, and the chasm that seemed to widen between us. "Emily, try to understand," Thomas pleaded. "This is a difficult situation for everyone. If you could just—" I didn't let him finish. "If I could what, Thomas? Confess to a crime I didn't commit? Accept being treated like a thief on my wedding day?" The tension was palpable. Sophie and my father were ready to intervene, feeling that the situation could degenerate at any moment. It was then that Thomas spoke the words that would change everything. Words I never thought I would hear from his mouth. "Maybe if you just confessed, we could work things out," he said, his voice barely audible. Time seemed to stand still. I stared at Thomas, searching in his eyes for a trace of the man I loved, the man I trusted. But all I saw was a stranger. Without thinking, my hand left. The slap echoed throughout the cafe, startling the other customers. Thomas took a step back, shocked, his cheek reddening where my hand had hit him. "How dare you?" I cried, tears flowing freely down my cheeks. "How dare you ask me to confess to something I didn't do?" The silence that followed was deafening. Thomas looked at me, a hand on his cheek, disbelief written on his face. Then, in an instant, his expression changed. Surprise gave way to anger, anger I had never seen in him before. What happened next will forever be etched in my memory as the moment my world fell apart for good. Thomas raised his hand. I experienced the movement as if in slow motion, unable to react. Then pain exploded across my cheek as his fist made contact with my face. I staggered backwards, barely caught by Sophie. The cries of surprise and indignation from the other customers of the cafe reached me as if through a fog. My father threw himself at Thomas, pinning him against the wall. "You bastard," my father roared, shaking Thomas like a plum tree. "How dare you lay a hand on my daughter?" The owner of the cafe intervened, separating the two men. "Out," he shouted. "Everyone get out of here before I call the police." Sophie was already guiding me towards the exit, protecting me from the curious and horrified looks of the other customers. My father followed us, giving Thomas one last murderous look before slamming the cafe door. Once outside, the reality of what had just happened hit me hard. The man I loved, the man I was going to marry, had just hit me. The shock, the pain, the betrayal, everything mixed together in a whirlwind of emotions that I couldn't untangle. "We need to go to the hospital," Sophie said, examining my cheek which was starting to swell. But I shook my head. "No," I whispered. "I just want to go home." My father nodded, understanding my need to get away from this place, from these memories. He hailed a taxi, and soon we were driving through the streets of Paris, leaving behind the church, the cafe, and the ruins of what should have been the happiest day of my life. The journey took place in heavy silence. I looked out the window without really seeing the landscape passing by. The lively streets of Paris, the crowded cafe terraces, the couples hand in hand. Everything seemed to belong to another world, a world to which I no longer belonged. When we got home, Sophie helped me up the stairs. My legs were shaking, and I felt drained of all energy. Once in my apartment, I headed straight to the bathroom. I needed to see for myself. The mirror reflected back to me the image of a stranger. A woman with reddened eyes, smeared makeup, a bruise already forming on her cheek. My wedding dress, that symbol of joy and hope, now seemed a cruel irony. I slowly took it off, letting the white fabric slide to my feet. Every movement reminded me of pain, physical and emotional. Sophie knocked gently on the door. "Emily, do you need help?" "No," I replied in a voice I didn't recognize. "I just need to be alone for a while." I heard his footsteps moving away, and the murmur of his conversation with my father in the living room. They were worried about me, I knew it. But in that moment, I couldn't face their worry, their pity. I slipped into the shower, letting the hot water run over my body. The tears mixed with the water, and I finally gave free rein to my sorrow. How did we get here? How could love turn so quickly into something so ugly, so painful? When I finally came out of the bathroom, wrapped in a bathrobe, I found Sophie and my father sitting in the living room. They jumped up when they saw me, worry showing on their faces. "My dear," my father began, "maybe we should go file a complaint." But I shook my head. "No, Dad. Not now. I can't. I can't face this right now." He nodded, understanding despite the anger that still shone in his eyes. Sophie came closer, gently taking me in her arms. "I'll stay with you tonight," she said. It wasn't a question. I nodded, grateful. The idea of facing this night alone scared me more than I wanted to admit. That night, lying in bed, I listened to the regular breathing of Sophie, who was sleeping on the sofa in the living room. Sleep eluded me, my mind constantly replaying the events of the day. Thomas' doubt, his mother's accusation, the slap, the blow. Each memory was like a dagger in my heart. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the curtains, I made a decision. I couldn't let this day define the rest of my life. I had been a victim, yes, but I refused to remain a victim. Somehow, I had to find the strength to move forward, to rebuild my life. With this resolution, I finally felt sleep overtaking me. A restless sleep, populated by confused dreams, but a sleep all the same. And when I woke up, I would have to face a new day, a new reality. A reality where I was no longer the bride-to-be, but a woman betrayed, hurt, but determined to get back up. The next morning, I was awakened by a ray of sunlight filtering through the curtains. For a brief moment, everything seemed normal. Then the searing pain in my cheek brought me back to reality. The events of the day before came flooding back to me like a tidal wave, leaving me breathless. I sat up slowly in my bed, each movement seeming to require superhuman effort. My reflection in my dresser mirror made me wince. A purplish hematoma spread across my left cheek, a cruel testimony to Thomas's betrayal. Sophie was still sleeping on the living room sofa. I quietly slipped out of the room, not wanting to wake her. In the kitchen, I turned on the coffee maker, the familiar sound bringing a semblance of normalcy to what was shaping up to be anything but a normal day. My phone, which I had turned off the day before, was taunting me on the counter. I knew I would have to turn it on at some point, face the outside world. But not now. Not right away. The coffee flowed slowly, its aroma filling the kitchen. I stared at the filling cup, trying to collect my thoughts. What should I do now? How was I going to explain the situation to my family, my friends, my colleagues? Shame and anger warred within me, leaving me confused and exhausted. Emily. Sophie's sleepy voice pulled me from my thoughts. She stood in the doorway, her hair disheveled, her face marked with worry. How are you feeling? I shrugged my shoulders, unable to find the words to describe the whirlwind of emotions inside me. Sophie came closer, enveloping me in a silent embrace. This simple gesture of affection brought back the tears that I had been holding back since I woke up. I'm here, she whispered, rubbing my back gently. We're going to get through this together. We stayed like that for a moment, the silence of the kitchen broken only by the sound of the coffee maker. Finally, I slowly pulled away, wiping my eyes. Thanks for staying, I said, my voice hoarse from crying. Sophie smiles at me sadly. That's normal. That's what friends are for, right? We sat at the kitchen table, each with a steaming cup of coffee. The silence stretched between us, comfortable but full of unsaid words. Maybe you should go see a doctor, Sophie suggested gently, pointing to my cheek with her chin. I shook my head. It'll be okay. It's just a bruise. Sophie frowned, visibly disagreeing, but didn't persist. She knew when not to push. What are you going to do now? She asked after a moment. That was the million-euro question. What was I going to do? My world had fallen apart in the space of a day. The future that I had imagined, planned, had evaporated like smoke. I don't know, I finally admitted. I guess I'll have to cancel the honeymoon. Tell the guests that the wedding is cancelled. Face my family, my colleagues. The to-do list seemed endless and overwhelming. How was I going to explain what happened? The truth seemed too cruel, too humiliating to share. You don't have to do everything right away, Sophie said, placing her hand on mine. Take the time you need. I nodded, grateful for his understanding. But I knew I couldn't put off the inevitable forever. With a sigh, I reached for my phone. It was time to face reality. As soon as I turned on the device, it started vibrating frantically. Dozens of notifications appeared, missed calls, messages, emails. Most came from family and friends, worried about not having any news. A few came from Thomas. My finger remained hovering over his name. Should I read his messages? What could he possibly have to say to me after what he had done? Before I could make a decision, the phone started ringing. My mother's name appeared on the screen. I took a deep breath and answered. Hello, Mom? Emily. My God, finally. We were worried to death. What happened? Where are you? My mother's questions poured out like a torrent. I closed my eyes, searching for the strength to respond. I'm home, Mom, I said softly. I'm fine. It's just, the wedding is cancelled. There was silence on the other end of the line. Then, in a hesitant voice, cancelled? But why? What happened, my darling? I glanced at Sophie, who nodded encouragingly. Taking a deep breath, I began to recount the events of the day before. The accusations from Thomas' mother, his lack of confidence in me, the argument at the cafe. When I got to the moment when Thomas had hit me, my voice cracked. The shocked gasp from my mother on the other end of the line made me realize how serious the situation was. Oh, darling, she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. I'll be right there. Despite my protests, she insisted on coming. An hour later, she was at my door, her arms full of shopping bags. I thought you might not want to go out, she explained, placing the bags on the kitchen counter. His gaze lingered on my face, and I saw his eyes fill with tears. Without a word, she took me in her arms, holding me tight against her like when I was little. The day passed in a blur of telephone conversations and visits. My father arrived shortly after my mother, anger and worry warring across his face. My brothers called, offering to look after Thomas, an offer I firmly declined despite a little voice inside me that found the idea tempting. Sophie stayed by my side, screening calls, managing visitors, making sure I ate and rested. His presence was a rock I clung to in the storm of my emotions. Towards the end of the afternoon, just as I was starting to feel overwhelmed by everything that was going on, my phone rang again. Thomas' name appeared on the screen. The room seemed to freeze. My parents and Sophie looked at me, waiting for my reaction. My heart was racing as I stared at the screen, unsure. You don't have to answer, my father said softly. But I knew I had to do it. If I wanted to move forward, I had to face this conversation. With a trembling hand, I answered. Hello, Emily. Thomas' voice was hoarse, as if he had been crying. I'm so sorry. I don't know what came over me. Stop, I interrupted, surprising even myself with the firmness of my voice. You can't erase what you've done with an apology, Thomas. There was silence on the other end of the line. Then, in a broken voice, I know I ruined everything. But I have to see you. There's something you need to know. My heart leapt in my chest. What could he possibly have to say to me? Part of me wanted to hang up, to cut all ties. But another part, smaller but insistent, wanted answers. I don't think that's a good idea, I finally said. Please, Emily, he pleaded. Just once. After that, if you never want to see me again, I'll understand. I closed my eyes, weighing the pros and cons. Finally, curiosity won out. Okay, I conceded. But not today. And not alone. We agreed to meet the next day at a cafe near my house. Sophie insisted on accompanying me, and I accepted gratefully. After hanging up, I turned to my family and Sophie. Their faces reflected a mixture of concern and support. Are you sure you want to see him? My mother asked, her voice tinged with apprehension. I nodded. I need to know. I need to understand why all this happened. That night, I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling, unable to fall asleep. What could Thomas have to say to me? What could possibly justify what had happened? As dawn began to break, I got up, resigned to a sleepless night. I made myself a coffee and sat on the balcony, watching Paris slowly wake up. Whatever this day had in store for me, I knew one thing: nothing would ever be the same again. But maybe, just maybe, I would find the answers I needed to start healing. The day of my meeting with Thomas dawned, grey and threatening. The Parisian sky seemed to reflect my state of mind, heavy with unanswered questions and apprehension. I prepared mechanically, choosing simple, comfortable clothes, far from the wedding dress I should have worn for our honeymoon. Sophie arrived early, her face full of worry and determination. Are you sure you want to do this? She asked me for the umpteenth time. I nodded, unable to put into words the complex mix of emotions swirling inside me. Fear, anger, curiosity, a remnant of love perhaps. Everything was mixed up in indescribable chaos. We headed towards the Café des Artistes, a small, quiet establishment where Thomas and I used to go. The choice of this place suddenly seemed cruel to me, full of happy memories that contrasted painfully with current reality. Thomas was already there when we arrived. He was sitting at a table in the back, his pale, drawn face betraying his lack of sleep. When he saw us, he stood up awkwardly, visibly hesitating how to greet us. "Emily," he said softly, his eyes lingering on my face, on the still visible mark of his blow. Guilt and shame were clearly visible in his eyes. "Thomas," I replied coldly, sitting down without offering him my hand. Sophie took a seat next to me, her presence reassuring. A heavy silence settled. The waiter came to take our orders, providing a brief welcome distraction. Finally, Thomas took a deep breath. "Thank you for coming," he began. "I know I don't deserve you to listen to me, but—" "Get to the point, Thomas," I interrupted. "You said you had something to tell me. So say it." He nodded, his hands playing nervously with his coffee cup. After what happened at the church and at the cafe, I went home to my parents. I was lost, angry, confused. And then, he paused, seeming to search for words. I felt my heart speed up, anticipating what was coming next. "I found the ring," he finally blurted out. The world seemed to stop for a moment. "What?" I whispered, incredulous. "My grandmother's emerald ring," Thomas continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "It was in my mother's room. She had just misplaced it." I felt anger rising inside me like a wave. "Lost," I repeated, my voice trembling with suppressed rage. "She accused me of stealing, ruined our marriage, and all because she misplaced her ring?" Thomas looked down, unable to meet my gaze. "I'm so sorry, Emily. I should have believed you. I should have." "Yes, you should have," I exploded, attracting looks from the other customers. But at that moment, I didn't care. "You should have trusted me. You should have defended me. Instead, you had me." Words failed me, memories of the blow resurfaced, reviving the pain and humiliation. Sophie placed a soothing hand on my arm. "Calm down, Emily," she whispered. Then, turning to Thomas, "And your mother? What did she say when you found the ring?" Thomas' face twisted into a grimace of shame. She refused to admit her mistake. She said that she had probably put it there and forgotten, but that Emily could still have taken it and put it back. I couldn't believe my ears. Even in the face of the evidence, this woman refused to admit her wrongs. "And you believed her?" I asked, incredulous. Thomas shook his head vigorously. "No, of course not. I had a huge argument with her. I told her that her behavior was unacceptable, that she had ruined our marriage, our happiness." He paused, running a trembling hand through his hair. "I left their house. I haven't spoken to them since." A heavy silence settled at our table. I stared at my coffee cup, trying to digest this new information. Part of me was relieved that the truth had come out, that my innocence had been proven. But another, larger part remained hurt and angry. "For what?" I finally asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Why didn't you believe me from the start?" Thomas looked up at me, his gaze filled with remorse. "I wish I had a good answer to give you, Emily. The truth is that I was a coward. I always had trouble standing up to my mother, you know that. And that day, faced with his accusations, I panicked. I should have trusted you. I should have remembered everything we had experienced together. But I left the fear and the doubt take over." His words resonated within me, bringing back memories of our past discussions about his complicated relationship with his mother. How many times had I tried to encourage him to assert himself in front of her? How many times had I witnessed his discomfort at family dinners? "That's not an excuse," Thomas continued, interrupting my thoughts. "Nothing can excuse what I did. Hitting you, it's unforgivable. I will never forgive myself." I felt tears welling up in my eyes. "You're right," I said softly. "This is unforgivable." Thomas nodded, accepting my words. "I know. I didn't come here to ask you to forgive me, Emily. I just wanted you to know the truth. You deserve at least that." We remained silent for a moment, each lost in our thoughts. Coffee around us continued its activity, the conversations and the noise of the cups forming a strange sound background to our personal drama. "What are you going to do now?" Sophie asked, breaking the silence. Thomas housed her shoulders. "I don't really know. I took a leave at work. I think I need to step back, think about it all. Maybe consult a therapist. I don't want to never again be this man who raised his hand on the woman he loves." His words touched me more than I wanted to admit. Despite everything that had happened, a little part of me was relieved to see that he recognized the gravity of his actions. "And you, Emily?" he asked softly. "What are you going to do?" I took a deep inspiration, realizing that I had not really thought about this question. In recent days had been a whirlwind of emotions and reactions, leaving me shortly to think about the future. "I don't know," I admit. "I guess I will have to officially cancel the wedding, warn the guests. And then there is work. I don't know how I will explain all that." "I can help you," proposed Thomas. "For the cancellations, I mean. To say the least." I hesitated for a moment before nodding my head. "Okay. But I prefer that it is Sophie who does the intermediary. I don't think I am ready to have more contact with you for the moment." Thomas nodded, understanding. "Of course. I understand." While our meeting was coming to an end, I felt strangely empty. The revelation of the truth should have given me a feeling of satisfaction, of justice. But instead, I just felt tired. Tired and sad for everything that had been lost. We lifted ourselves, the heavy atmosphere of unsaid and regret. When leaving, Thomas made a gesture as if to touch me, but was delighted at the last moment. "I'm really sorry, Emily," he said one last time. "For everything." I looked at him, this man I liked, whom I thought I knew. Despite pain and anger, I couldn't help but feel a hint of pity for him. "Goodbye, Thomas," I said simply before I diverted me. Sophie and I left coffee, leaving behind not only Thomas, but also the broken remains of what should have been our future together. While we were walking in the streets of Paris, I felt a weight getting up of my shoulders. The truth was finally known, my name was washed with any suspicion. But I knew that the path to healing would be long. Broken confidence, annihilated dreams, physical and emotional pain. All this would take time to heal. However, for the first time since that fateful day in Church, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe one day, I could look back and see this event not as the end of everything, but as the start of a new chapter in my life. The days following my meeting with Thomas passed through a fog of reflection and introspection. The revelation of the truth about the ring had brought a certain relief, but it had also opened the door to a myriad of questions about my future. Every morning, I woke up with a feeling of emptiness, as if I floated in a space between my old life and a new one that I could not yet imagine. Sophie, faithful to her promise, took care of the logistics of the cancellation of marriage. She managed calls to guests, the caterer, the florist, sparing me the pain of having to explain again and again why the big day would not take place. I was infinitely grateful to her, even if each time she made me a report, I felt my heart tighten a little more. One morning, when I took my coffee on the balcony of my apartment, looking at Paris to wake up, my phone vibrated. It was a message from Thomas. "I started therapy. I know it doesn't change anything I did, but I wanted you to know. Take care of you, Emily." I stared at the screen for a long time, not knowing how to react. Part of me was relieved that he was looking for help, recognizing that he had problem solving. Another game remained suspicious, wondering if it was not just an attempt to regain my sympathy. This message was the catalyst I needed to start thinking seriously about my future. Until then, I had been in a kind of survival mode, managing day-to-day emergencies. But it was time to make decisions. I decided to take a few days off to think. My boss, understanding in front of my situation, accepted without hesitation. "Take the time you need, Emily," he told me. "Your work will be there when you come back." The first day, I went to the Luxembourg Garden. It was a place where Thomas and I liked to walk, discuss our projects for the future. Today, I went there alone, a notebook in hand, determined to put order in my thoughts. Sitting on a bench, facing the large pool, I started writing. My feelings, my fears, my hopes. Everything poured out on paper in an uninterrupted flow. I realized how much I needed this moment, this catharsis. Over the writing, one thing was clear: I couldn't go back. Even if Thomas followed therapy, even if he changed, confidence had been irreparably broken. The blow he had brought to me had left a much deeper brand than that, now almost erased, on my cheek. On the second day, I met my mother for lunch. We settled on the terrace of a small bistro, taking advantage of the spring sun. "How are you really, darling?" she asked, her eyes scrutinizing my face with concern. I took a deep breath. "It's better. I think I start to see more clearly." She nodded, encouraging me to continue. I think I can't forgive Thomas," I said slowly. "At least not now. Maybe never." My mother took my hand in hers. "It's normal, Emily. What he did is serious. You don't have to forgive." His words comforted me more than I would have thought. Having the permission not to forgive, not to try to save a relationship that had injured me so much at all costs, was liberating. "What are you planning to do now?" she asked. I think for a moment before answering. "I think I need to change the air. Maybe take sabbatical leave, travel a little." The idea had germinated in my mind the day before, while I was distractedly leafing through a travel magazine. The image of a white sandy beach in Seychelles had made me dream of an escape, again. My mother smiles. "I think it's a great idea. You need to find yourself, to rebuild yourself far from it all." On the third day, I met Sophie in our favorite cafe. I told him about my reflections, my desire to leave. "I'm proud of you, Emily," she said, hugging me. "You take care of yourself, it's the most important." We spent the afternoon exploring potential destinations, dreaming of adventures and new horizons. For the first time for a long time, I have been surprised to laugh, to project myself into the future with enthusiasm. On the fourth day, I returned to work. I had made my decision. In my boss's office, I took a deep inspiration before speaking. "I would like to take sabbatical leave," I announced. "I need to step back, to travel a little." My boss listened to me carefully, nodding my head with understanding. "I think it's a wise decision, Emily. How long do you think you are going?" 6 months, I replied, surprised by my own audacity. "If it is possible, of course." To my surprise, he accepted without hesitation. "You are a precious employee, Emily. Take the time you need. Your post will wait for you when you return." Relief and gratitude invaded me. This conversation marked the concrete start of my new chapter. The following days were a whirlwind of preparations. I finally chose the Seychelles as the first destination, with the idea of perhaps exploring other countries afterwards. Sophie helped me plan my route, excited as if it was she who was leaving. A week after my meeting with Thomas, I found myself again in front of him. This time it was I who asked to see it. We ended up in a park, neutral land. "I am leaving," I announced to him without preamble. "I took sabbatical leave. I'm going to travel for 6 months." Thomas looked at me, a glimmer of sadness in the eyes, but also of understanding. "I understand," he said slowly. "You need that." I nodded. "Yes. I need to meet, heal." A silence settled between us, responsible for unsaid and regret. "I'm sorry, Emily," he said finally. "For everything. I hope you can forgive me." I looked at him, this man I liked, whom I thought I knew. Despite the pain and the anger that remained, I felt a form of peace invaded me. "Maybe one day," I said slowly. "But not now. Now, I need to think of me." We separated on these words, a page turning permanently in our lives. The day of my departure arrived quickly. On the station platform, ready to take the train for the airport, I was surrounded by my family and Sophie. The goodbye were moving, but tinged with hope and excitation. "Take care of you, my darling," said my mother, hugging me in her arms. "Take advantage of it, but don't forget to give us news," added my father with a smile. Sophie was the last to hug me. "I will miss you so much," she whispered. "But I'm so proud of you." As I got on the train, my bag on my shoulder, I felt light for the first time in weeks. The future was uncertain, but he was mine. I had made my decision, chose to focus on myself, on my healing and my personal growth. The train started, slowly leaving the station. I looked out by the window, seeing Paris move away. Part of me felt sadness, leaving so many memories behind me, good and bad. But another, stronger part was filled with hope and anticipation. I did not know what these 6 months were going to bring me. I didn't know who I would be on my return. But I knew one thing: I had made the right decision. This adventure was the first step towards my reconstruction, towards a stronger, wiser Emily, ready to kiss life with a new look. While the landscape marched before my eyes, I took out my newspaper and began to write. Not on the past this time, but on the future. On my hopes, my dreams, the things I wanted to accomplish. For the first time in a long time, I really felt free, mistress of my destiny. The trip was just beginning, and I was ready to welcome him with open arms. The sun of the Seychelles caressed my skin while I woke up gently, rocked by the sound of the waves. It has been a month since I had left Paris for a month, leaving behind a life that now seemed to me to belong to another person. Each morning, opening my eyes to this earthly paradise, I felt a little lighter, a little more myself. The first days had been difficult. Despite the breathtaking beauty of the island, I felt lost, disoriented. The jet lag was only an excuse to hide the real gap that I felt, the one between the life I had imagined and the one I lived now. But little by little, I started opening up to this new reality. I spent my days exploring the island, getting lost in its lush forests, swimming in its crystal clear waters. Each evening, sitting on the beach, I contemplated the sun on the Indian Ocean, its flamboyant colors seeming to take with them a little more of my pain. It was during one of these evenings that I got to know Luc, a French photographer who has been traveling the world for years. We had started to discuss, sharing our travel experiences and our stories. Without really realizing it, I surprised myself to tell him my story, that of marriage that had not taken place, betrayal, violence. Luc had listened to me without judging, simply offering an attentive ear and a shoulder on which cry. That night, for the first time for a long time, I felt a weight getting up of my shoulders. Talking to a stranger, someone who did not know Thomas or my life in Paris, had a cathartic effect that I had not anticipated. The following days, Luc and I continued to see us. He had introduced me to photography, teaching me to capture the beauty of the island through the lens. I had discovered a new passion, a way to express what I felt without needing words. One evening, when we were sorting our photos of the day, Luc looked at me with an enigmatic smile. "You know, Emily," he said, "I think you should consider extending your trip." I had laughed, thinking he was joking. But his gaze was serious. "I'm serious," he continued. "I have a friend who runs a diving center in Thailand. He is looking for someone to help him with administration and communication. It could be a great opportunity for you." The idea first seemed to me crazy. Me, in Thailand? Working in a diving center? It was light years from my Parisian life, my work in finance. But the more I thought about it, the more the idea made its way. Wasn't that exactly what I needed? A chance to reinvent me completely, far from everything that reminded me of my old life. After several days of reflection and long conversations with Sophie via Skype, I made my decision. I was going to do it. I was going to extend my sabbatical leave and leave for Thailand. The day of my departure from the Seychelles was both sad and exciting. I say goodbye to Luc, thanking him for his friendship and for having opened my eyes to new possibilities. He made me promise to send him photos of my adventures in Thailand. The arrival in Bangkok was a culture shock. Spicy smells, constant noise, wet heat. Everything was so different from what I knew. But strangely, I felt in my place in this organized chaos. The diving center was on a small island in southern Thailand. As soon as I arrived, I was welcomed by Mark, the friend of Luc, a French expatriate for more than 10 years. His enthusiasm was contagious, and I surprised myself to smile more than I had done for months. The first weeks were intense. I learned the bases of diving while taking care of the administration of the center. It was a demanding, but rewarding job. Each evening, exhausted but satisfied, I fell asleep to the sound of the waves, a feeling of peace that suits me little by little. One day, while I was working on the center website, Mark came to see me with an unexpected proposal. "Emily," he said, "I saw the photos you took. They are really good. What would you like to use them for our new brochure?" I was surprised and flattered. Luke's lessons had borne fruit, but I had never thought that my photos could be used professionally. It was the start of a new adventure. In addition to my administrative work, I began to document the life of the diving center. I photographed divers, colored fish, coral reefs. Each shot reminded me how beautiful and surprising life could be. The months passed, and I realized that I no longer wanted to return to Paris. My life here, simple but filled me in a way that I would never have imagined. One evening, sitting on the beach watching the sunset, I released my phone and composed the number of my former boss in Paris. "Hello, Jean-Pierre," I said when he picked up. "I hope I don't mind." "Emily, what a pleasure to hear you. How is your trip going?" I took a deep breath. "That's just what I wanted to tell you about. I don't think I come back to Paris." There was a moment of silence at the other end of the line. "I see," he said finally. "Are you sure of yourself?" "Yes," I replied, surprised by my own certainty. "I found something here, a life that suits me. I know it's unexpected, but—" "Emily," he interrupted me gently, "you don't have to justify yourself. I am happy for you. You deserve this happiness." His words touched me deeply. After hanging up, I remained long to contemplate the ocean, reflecting on the path traveled. The next day, I called my family and Sophie to tell them my decision. They were surprised, of course, but also incredibly understanding and supporting. "You look happy, darling," said my mother. "That's all that matters to us." Sophie, faithful to herself, was already planning her visit. "You still don't think I'm going to let you live this dream alone?" she joked. The weeks that followed were filled with changes. I found a small bungalow near the beach, began to learn the Thai, and invest myself even more in my work in the diving center. One evening, when I sorted my photos of the day, I came across an old image of me and Thomas. I was surprised to see that the pain I expected to feel was absent. Instead, I felt a sweet melancholy, almost gratitude. Without this painful experience, I would never have had the courage to leave everything, to really discover myself. I took my newspaper and started writing, as I did every night since my departure from Paris. But this time, instead of talking about the past, I wrote about the future. On my projects to develop my skills in photography, on my desire to explore other islands in the region, on the peace that I had found here. By closing my newspaper, I realized that for the first time for a long time, I was really happy. Not in a brilliant and noisy way, but in a deep and serene way. The path had been long and difficult, but I had finally found my place. Here, on this little Thai island, I found much more than a new start. I had found a new Emily, stronger, wiser, ready to kiss life in all its complexity. While I fell asleep that night, rocked by the sound of the waves, I smile. Tomorrow would be a new day, filled with new adventures, new challenges. And I was ready to face them, a photo at a time.